Hello and welcome to the 8th video on ancient Rome. Today we are going to look at the government institutions of ancient Rome. And it was the formation of these institutions that allowed the Roman Republic to become what it ultimately became, a world power during ancient times. And when you talk about the Roman government, you are talking about three main areas: the Roman Senate, the Roman Assemblies, and the various offices and posts which also had a lot of power, posts like the consul and censor, and we will get into all of that in a few minutes. Now, most of these government institutions were established during the time of the Republic. So it is really during the time of the Republic that Rome sees its greatest expansion. And it was the government that built up the Roman army, Roman cities, and all the establishments to allow Rome to become a dominant power. Now, today the U.S. Senate is actually loosely based off the Roman Senate, so you can see the influence that the Roman government had for all time. Okay, let's take a look at the Roman Senate first. Now, the leaders of each clan had a representative in the Roman Senate, and this usually was the father of the family, or the patriarch. And the Roman Senate was actually founded during the time of the Roman king, and during that time, it acted more like an advisory board. So it didn't have any real power, but it gave advice to the Roman king. Now that power increased after the Republic was established. And so the Roman Senate became the dominant political institution during the time of the Roman Republic. The actual word Senate derives from the Latin word senex, which translates to old man. And as I said, the leader of each clan was usually a member in the Senate. Initially, the Senate consisted of 100 senators, and these were open only to patricians. Now, later on, the Senate would be open to plebeians as well. The Senate passed its own mandates called senatus consulta. Now, it is very important to note that these mandates were not considered laws. However, they were almost always obeyed. And so that's why it is actually called senatus consulta, because this is advice. But these so-called mandates were executed by the two Roman consuls, who were the chief magistrates of ancient Rome. Now, sessions in the Roman Senate usually began early in the day and were directed by a consul. Each senator and magistrate had their turn to speak on the issue at hand. Before the decree was passed, it could be vetoed by a tribune. Votes were either done by a roll call, or in the case of major legislation, the senators voted by taking a place on either side of the Senate chamber. The Roman Senate had the power to declare war, fund campaigns, and supply armies. But the main focus of the Senate was on foreign policy. And what does foreign policy mean? That means wars and acquiring and conquering new territory. So that was the main function of the Roman Senate. And so it is the Roman Senate that contributed to Rome's rapid conquests during the next several centuries. This would help shape the government for the next 500 years, from 509 BC right up until the time of the formation of the Roman Empire. After the Roman Republic ended, the balance of power shifted from the Senate and Assemblies to the Roman Emperor. Augustus, however, was clever enough to keep the Senate around to maintain the illusion of a republic, but its existence during imperial times was merely for show, as the emperor wielded most of the power. Even so, membership in the Senate was still desired, and it continued to represent prestige and social standing, even though it lacked any power. Okay, let's move on to the assemblies in ancient Rome. The first one was called the Century Assembly, and this assembly had the power to declare wars and pass peace treaties. They also had another very powerful function in that the Century Assembly elected consuls and praetors. The next assembly was called the Tribal Assembly. Now, the Tribal Assembly elected all of the junior magistrates. And these were important because they were able to take some of the load off of the consuls. And this was especially important as Rome expanded. It simply was not practical for the two Roman consuls to run the entire show. Now, the tribal assembly was run by the Roman consul. Okay, let's take a look at the People's Assembly. Now, this was similar to the tribal assembly in which laws were passed, except no patricians were allowed. Only plebeians were allowed here, and the meetings between the plebeians were held in a permanent assembly. The sessions were called by the tribunes, who were elected to represent the people's interests. To prevent any conflict of interest, patricians were not permitted to join this assembly. The assembly passed resolutions which became law, and this, of course, was different from the Senate, whose acts were considered non-binding. And more importantly, these laws applied to both patricians and plebeians. And so this was one of the more important assemblies in the Roman government. Okay, let's take a look at the various offices and posts during the time of ancient Rome. The first we'll examine, of course, is the Roman consul. Roman consuls were the most powerful magistrates that controlled both military operations and political functions. Now, this dual nature of this job might seem strange in the modern sense, but it worked very well for the Romans. Roman consuls were appointed for a term of just 1 year as a precaution against tyranny. During this term, the consul acted as the head of state, so they might be considered somewhat similar to the modern president. Now, election to the consulship was considered the highest honor. They controlled the debates in the Roman Senate and had extensive powers. But they were not kings in the true sense, as Romans had overthrown the monarchy in a revolution. The consuls still had to be elected, and the Senate could always pass their own mandates against the consul's will. And of course, there were 2 consuls, not 1. And each had veto power over the other. So their power was limited. And this, of course, created a series of checks and balances so that no one man could rule Rome by decree. Each consul was given his own army to command, and the Roman consul controlled the movement and tactics of that army. If only one army was available, the command rotated between the consuls on a daily basis. This inherent weakness was exploited by Rome's enemies, as we will see later on in the case of Hannibal. During their 1-year term, consuls were granted imperium. It was imperium that gave the consul total control of the army and the ability to administer justice. Roman consuls were not professionally trained, but had a wealth of experience serving on the staffs of other Roman generals. In addition, it was not uncommon in any given year to have a plebeian and a patrician elected as consul. This was a result of the political changes granting the plebeians more rights. Okay, let's take a look at the Roman tribune. And as I mentioned before, they were elected by the people. So they represented the plebeians, and later on they would represent the lower classes. Tribunes acted as a balance of power against the patrician-dominated Senate. The tribune could veto any decision by the Senate or consul. Tribunes could even veto other tribunes. And as I mentioned before, the office could not be held by patricians, so that there was no conflict of interest. Now, the Senate could get around this by sometimes securing the appointments of tribunes that represented the interests of the Senate. Now, the tribune appointment also was for 1 year, and during that term, no one could interfere with the tribune. Violating this law was considered a capital offense and punishable by death. Now, this only applied to the city limits within Rome. Okay, the next important post was the office of the Pontifex Maximus. Now, this was the chief priest in Rome, and he ran the all-important College of Pontiffs, and that was the religious body that administered the public religion of the Romans. Control of this religious office was extremely important, perhaps second only to the title of consul. Often it was common to have this title before an aristocrat achieved the title of consul. So, for instance, Julius Caesar secured this title before he became a consul. Now, there were some other offices we'll talk about here. There was also the Roman praetor. Now, this office contained many of the powers of the consul. And as I mentioned before, it was initially created to remove some of the daily burdens off of the consul. Like consuls, praetors functioned as powerful magistrates. They answered only to the consul and usually were assigned a province to administer. And so they functioned more as a governor, in which they controlled all of the high-level tasks of a functioning government. They also controlled the Roman legions in their respective province, provided a Roman consul was not already based there. There was fierce competition to secure an appointment as a praetor of a rich province. These appointments essentially became large commercial enterprises in which huge amounts of plunder and booty could be acquired by a victorious praetor. Okay, let's take a look at the post of dictator. And of course, that sort of has a negative connotation today. But during the times of Rome, it was a critical post. The dictator was appointed by the Senate, and this almost always involved a crisis that involved a major war or revolt that was going poorly for Rome. This office was extremely useful when one of the 2 consuls was failing in his duty and Rome was under threat. Since there was little time to debate issues in the Senate, the dictator was more effective in controlling war policy. We will see this office used later in the Titanic Punic Wars. The dictator controlled every aspect of the state and conducted all of the armies in the field. The dictator also appointed a deputy, which was the master of the horse. This appointment, however, was not permanent. The dictator, by Roman tradition, was required to return all control to the Roman Senate after a 6-month period. Now, we will see men like Caesar later on abuse this role and use the office to rule autocratically. And we will get to that when we get to the times of Caesar. Okay, let's talk about the Roman censor really quickly here. This was an office that was held by 2 ex-consuls every 5 years, and this was for the purpose of conducting a registry of all the Roman citizens and their property. The censor also could audit other magistrates as well as state finances. Okay, let's talk about one final item here, the Roman Forum, which was of course located in the center of ancient Rome. The Forum was the hub for all government activity. It contained the Senate and all other important government offices. A successful Roman general always received his triumph at the Roman Forum. Many of the commercial activities also took place in the Forum. The Forum underwent many renovations during several epochs. Today, the ruins of the Roman Forum still exist and are visited by millions of tourists worldwide. Okay, that's going to wrap it up. I will see you guys in the next video.